Hello and welcome to week 3 of political behavior. This week we are looking at conventional political participation. Next week we'll look at unconventional political participation, things like participating in protests and the like. But this week we're going to focus on elements like voting or participating or otherwise volunteering in a political campaign, what we call conventional political participation. Now, before we really get into it here, we need to break down participation into two separate yet related questions. First is the choice on whether or not to participate, and in terms of voting, the second is which candidate or which party an individual is going to vote for. These two questions, generally broken down into vote choice versus the choice to vote, are, as I say, separate yet related. This week, we are going to focus on the choice on whether or not to vote, as well as other forms of political participation. In order to do this, we need to conceptualize why people actually participate in politics or not. There's a couple different frameworks through which we can view this. The first of these is what we might call a rational choice or otherwise economic approach. Within this approach, the choice on whether or not to participate is a function of an economic or otherwise rational choice cost-benefit analysis. People choose to participate when the benefits outweigh the costs. And the costs of participation are myriad. They can be informational, they can be time, the time that you have to take off of work, the time it takes to get to the polling place, the time away from any other activity that you might be doing that you contribute to a campaign. The benefits in this context are the benefits of your candidate winning. More specifically, though, the benefits of your candidate winning compared to the benefits or losses that you might incur if your least preferred candidate actually wins. Costs can also be personalized, but within this framework, you may understand in your own personal life that people are not always entirely rational. The idea that people are going to make a rational choice calculation just simply on the basis of costs and benefits on whether or not to vote or whether or not to participate may be somewhat unrealistic. This leads into the second framework or second approach within political participation. This is an affect or preference-based approach. Essentially, the logic goes as people's preferences, as people's affect towards a candidate or towards a party increases, they are more and more likely to participate. This may take the form of reaching a certain threshold after which an individual will vote or otherwise participate politically, but this kind of affect or preference-based approach might explain some of the limits to the rational choice-based approach, as it allows for the inclusion of things like partisanship or polarization or social pressures, these kind of non-material benefits that an individual might get from participation. Another element we need to touch on here is what Riker and Ordershuk in 1968 termed the civic duty. It is not just the case that your benefits from voting or your benefits from participating politically are going to be material in nature, dollars and cents. Instead, you might get what the authors called psychic satisfactions, or what we might consider to be the warm and fuzzies from participating politically. If you have gone to the polling booth before and you cast your ballot, you might have noticed on the way out the door that you felt rather good about yourself, that you felt like you had done your duty as a citizen. You had been a good person. This is kind of related to the sticker that you get. It's a good way to signal to everyone else around you that you are a good person. But there is something about participating politically that provides an intrinsic, or as the authors put it, a psychic satisfaction. These benefits might increase the likelihood of someone participating politically. Now, all of these operate in tandem with what your textbook talks about in the factors that affect the likelihood of individuals participating. Things like demographic factors, socioeconomic, institutional, psychological, and even genetic factors may have a role here. In terms of demographic factors, we all know that young people vote the least, participate in politics the least. There are a variety of plausible and potentially correct explanations for this. One of these is that young people simply have not gotten into the habit of voting. Another is that young people generally don't have the material or otherwise wealth benefits that may be at risk if their least preferred candidate votes. They also may not have or have the least amount of connection to the political system. Another demographic factor to consider here are racial categories. We know in the American South, with Jim Crow laws and the legacy of slavery in America, that African American people and other communities of color were systematically disenfranchised throughout the American South. If you choose to read Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes this week, they will briefly discuss some of this here. However, these long-term or otherwise enduring effects haven't manifested as we might expect. We might expect lower rates of participation, lower rates of engagement with the political system. But one of the byproducts of the Jim Crow system were robust political organizations in the American South that, when we look today, participation rates are actually higher than other demographic groups. Some other socioeconomic factors, things like education, things like wealth, may allow individuals to better incur the costs of voting. They may be better able to take time off of work or actually get to the polling place. Moreover, they may have a greater psychic satisfaction from voting or a greater sense of civic duty. Moreover, they may be more educated about politics and therefore better, basically have stronger political preferences within this way. In terms of psychological and genetic factors, it may be the case that people are predisposed to be more or less politically engaged. It may be the case that people are psychologically or genetically predisposed to be more outgoing, gregarious, extroverted, as it were. Specifically in reference to genetic explanations, we can only really make those claims on the basis of twin studies, and twin studies are very rare, as the number of twins in single family units relatively rare. Very difficult to isolate those, and there's a whole host of ethical considerations as well. We'll talk a little later in the semester about some more psychological factors here, but all of these may interact with either the utility or otherwise rational choice-based approach or the affect or preference-based approach here, explaining or failing to explain various aspects of it. Another question to consider here is, should we consider voting and other forms of political participation to exist upon the same continuum? To put it another way, and using the preference approach here, as someone's preference for a candidate increases, right, we should see that their likelihood of voting increases. But is it the case that as that preference further increases, they're more and more likely to volunteer for that campaign or contribute money to that campaign? Or is it the case that there are disparate cultures, different civic socialization processes where people are raised in different forms of political participation? When growing up, if you see your parents or one parent participating in politics solely by voting, they don't really talk about it. Every 2 years they vote in the federal elections, or every 4 years they vote for whoever the president may be, and that's kind of the end of their political involvement. You may be socialized into thinking that's the extent of all of the political participation that you may do. Conversely, however, if you are brought up in an environment where participating in protests, participating in terms of volunteering with campaigns or contributing to campaigns is expected, taking an active role in terms of conversations with friends and other non-voting forms of political participation, you may be socialized into that being the appropriate mode of political participation. So where these two people have the same degree of preference, they may express that preference through political participation in different ways. Now, this week, you have the choice between reading, I believe, Chapter 5 in Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, as well as Chapters 1 and 2 in V.O. Key. Now, don't let the Chapters 1 and 2 fool you. These are roughly the same length here. Read, the first few paragraphs of each to determine which you actually want to read. Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes here, they look at how we measure turnout and the effects of intensity on preference in terms of the likelihood to vote. How we measure turnout is actually an interesting question here. Is it just out of all people, regardless of age, regardless of registration status, how many voted? Is that the turnout rate? Or is it how many people were registered versus how many people voted? And the way that we measure turnout matters for the implications that we draw thereof. He, on the other hand, characterizes voting not in terms of voting versus not voting, but in terms of voting behaviors. He characterizes this in terms of stand patters, switchers, and new voters. Stand patters are people who voted for the same party in one election to the next. Switchers are people who voted for the previous party in the previous election, but voted for a different party in the current election. And new voters are those who did not vote in the previous election. He in particular is really interesting in terms of the way that he conceptualizes voting, because very often people use the status quo, or what they did previously, as their reference point. And by understanding why someone might switch from voting for a Republican to voting for a Democrat, we may be able to better understand the reasons for their voting behavior. The final thing I want to leave you with here today is basically how do we conceptualize non-voting, abstention, or otherwise a lack of political participation? And the question here is this itself a form of political expression, or is this the lack of political expression? When we look at political abstention, when we look at a refusal to participate politically, there are a number of potential explanations here. I just want to touch on perhaps the four most common. The first of these is satisfaction with the status quo. Individuals may choose not to participate politically because they are happy no matter who wins. Even if the Democrat or even if the Republican wins, people view their own personal circumstances as very much unlikely to change. And therefore, they see no reason to incur the relative costs of participating politically or expending those resources to participate politically. The kind of flip side of this, though, is if someone's preferences for the ideal form of government that they would like to see implemented through elections is so far away from either party, then it basically becomes irrelevant which party actually is elected. If, for example, you are an environmentalist and you see the need to take drastic action in terms to forestall the worst parts of climate change, and neither party is actually offering to do what you want or do what you view as necessary, you may not vote for either party out of what we might call a protest vote. I personally would argue both of these are forms of political expression, even though the individual did not participate politically. The other two reasons why someone might abstain or fail to participate politically are from, shall we say, critical lack of knowledge. They don't know how to get involved. They don't know how to get registered. They don't know how to vote or even who to vote for. They are so removed from the political process that even taking that first step is a step too far. The other one here is a lack of political efficacy, or what we might consider to be a lack of feeling that an individual can meaningfully influence the system. This might be because they lack those resources or because they view the system as somehow rigged or somehow not responsive. At least in my view, I would view these latter two explanations as the absence of political expression, not an alternative form. So that's all I really have for you today. Keep an eye on this week's upcoming deadlines. I'll make an announcement on Canvas to that effect as well. And as always, feel free to contact me with any questions or concerns that you may have. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you presumably next Monday.